Well, good morning, everyone. It's Dan Basse with Ben Buckner coming to you on Thursday, the day before the USDA crop report tomorrow. We've got markets that have a lot of geopolitical things going on. Of course, the Trump administration now proposing to put 50% tariffs on Brazil. Of course, that would impact mostly the coffee market and the beef market in the United States. But even with that, the Brazilian currency fell last night by about 2 to 3%. That means that Brazilian farmers are likely to be bigger sellers today. But again, with the USDA report ahead, I doubt that that's going to have a tremendous impact until we get past the numbers. Ben, we're going to look to you and see what you think in terms of overall views, but give us a rundown of where we are today.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on today. From CONAB releasing new estimates, raising corn production. We've got the U.S.-Mexican border closed in terms of feeder cattle trade. We are so like corn, soybeans, and wheat, focus on cash markets, balance sheets. So the break is paused. I think it does make sense for now. We do have the WASDE tomorrow, and I think the story for tomorrow's WASDE will be U.S. corn exports and what they do with old crop corn exports and old crop corn stocks. The feed residual use from the quarterly stocks report a couple weeks ago was not bullish, but also do exports offset this? And so we have seen kind of a jump or rejuvenation in old crop export demand. Corn export sales in the week ending July 3rd were 50 million bushels. It compares to 21 million bushels the previous week and 21 million the same week a year ago. And you kind of see on the graphic to the left that it's counter-seasonal for U.S. corn exports to increase, after about June 15th or so. We are seeing U.S. corn today competitive against Brazil and very cheap compared to Ukrainian origin, which is very expensive. And so I think that's still funneling some demand to the U.S. market. Even soybean sales, though, 20 million bushels for 17 million the previous week and just 7 million the same week a year ago. And that's also a bit counter-seasonal. So the U.S. market is finding some measure of export demand. And I think, after following the break, it's telling us that end users, at least today, are willing to jump on those big time corrections. Soybean export sales, also total commitments, are now 3 million above the USDA's forecast, which is not unusual, but they're not going to lower. USDA is not going to lower soybean exports for old crop, certainly. But it's corn. So we are now about 81 million bushels we've committed to the world market, 81 million bushels more than the USDA forecast for the whole year. There are still 8 weeks in the 24-25 crop year. And we'd like to track this against the USDA's forecast and just kind of compare that to history. And so the U.S. exporter has sold 103% of the USDA's annual corn export forecast, and that is unusual. This is a record number. So I think they have got to raise old crop exports tomorrow. The question is by how much? Is it 50 million? It could be 75, possibly 100 million bushels. And so I think you may cross that threshold in that they will lower feed and residual use. We did get that information from the stocks report. But could you have a net decrease in stocks of 25, 50 million bushels? So, old crop corn is not going to be abundant. That hasn't given us much excitement in the futures market and in the cash markets. We're looking at basis at major markets that are pretty unremarkable. But I do think for now, maybe that does kind of slow down the break. Or again, like we have seen, end users are seemingly willing to jump on these current prices. So we're looking for a much higher U.S. corn export number in tomorrow's WASDE. But it's not really corn by itself that concerns us when we think about future price discovery and the feed market as a whole. So I know we're going to see lots of private yield estimates for corn. We can all kind of see and feel what weather patterns are doing, broadly favorable still. But I think it's the fringe markets that really kind of put the almost nail in the coffin on the corn market longer term. So also tomorrow, the USDA will give us its first pass at by class specific wheat supply and demand. And so we have that on the left you see here, and we're using NASS acreage from their June acreage report. We're assuming a yield just a little bit above trend. That's based on weather conditions and also now reported yields that we're hearing kind of nationwide. So we think production will be about 750 million bushels. We're even assuming that, the more we produce, the more we will use. So domestic use will expand. Exports may expand just a little bit. We'll get a little bit more of that high pro market share. But even assuming we find 50 million additional bushels of hard red demand, we're still left with about 460 million bushel of end stocks in the 25-26 crop year. And you kind of see what that looks like relative to the last decade and a half. It's a pretty big number. It's not the highest on record, but it does seem like the hard red market's got to do something to find even more domestic use, more exports. In the long term, thesis that we've got is, to balance this in 26, 27, probably need to discourage acres. I don't know if we need to lose 1 million, 2 million, or 3 million hard red acres, but if that's not the case, then you keep stocks, pretty close to 500 million bushels indefinitely if Mother Nature cooperates. So corn's got to compete with hard red, I think, for plains feed use. Not going to see a lot more cattle as well. So that's one of our concerns. But even the sorghum market, I think the USDA sorghum balance sheet is probably set to loosen pretty considerably in both old crop and new crop positions. So we're just kind of tracking what we're doing in the export market. The USDA has kind of recognized the sort of poor nature of U.S. sorghum export demand, but even to date, it's falling short of that forecast. So far, we've only shipped officially through the end of May 74 million bushels of sorghum to all buyers, and that's down about 65% from where we were a year ago. So most likely, the final sorghum export number is going to fall 5 or 10 million bushels short of the USDA's forecast. That gets added to stocks. But like corn, sorghum is experiencing very, very favorable weather across the plains. We didn't lose any acres. And so the USDA, to kind of balance its 25-26 sorghum balance sheet, has exports increasing 150 million bushels to 250 million. And that seems like that only happens if there's a deal with China, which we're still hopeful does happen. And if that is the case, I think China does buy sorghum first, maybe. But if we don't get a deal with China, I think we're probably stuck with sorghum exports of 100, 125 million. And so you see on the right, that gives us in stocks of 93 million bushels. That's a multi-decade high. So thinking about the spine of the U.S., grain that's available, we think it'll be pretty abundant. And the goal of these markets is either to find pretty incredible demand growth or cut new crop acres in 2026. So not at least terribly bearish. So it's not just corn by itself, high yields, but it's the competition for demand. And again, we're all kind of getting more evidence that this Brazilian crop is higher or larger than the USDA's forecast. And I think eventually that does start to compete with U.S. exports, August onwards. So this is what this looks like. And so, all of a sudden, our forecast for combined corn, hard red wheat, and sorghum stocks in the U.S. is about 3.5 billion bushels. That is now the highest since 2016. And we all kind of remember what 2016 to 2018 markets looked like. It's pretty boring, pretty deflated. And I think we're kind of measuring the odds that we kind of enter to another period like that until we get the next big supply dislocation or some pretty successful trade deals. Again, it's all weather trade deals it agrees with. Checking in on our friends at NOAA, the most reliable forecast, probably the 5-day forecast, and this is what that looks like. There is some debate on whether or how much it rains in Illinois. All these principal forecasting computer models are not in agreement. So this is what NOAA thinks as of this morning for the next 5 days. It'll be pretty timely. So, not as much as we would like, maybe not enough in Indiana, Ohio, but the Western Corn Belt's very well watered. It's kind of Illinois. Does rain expand into Illinois in the next couple of days? NOAA's telling us that it does. So this is, I think, what the market's thinking. We'll kind of measure radar maps, rain gauges over the next 5 days, but the forecast at least does look pretty good. No real heat. And to that end, we think big picture. Again, we think the feed market's going to be abundantly supplied until the next supply dislocation, and when or if that happens. And so the INSO forecast we're looking at, updated from the Australian Meteorological Bureau, this matters most to them. They are the best at doing this. They are pretty rigid in projecting neutral INSO for the next 6 or 7 months, into the early part of 2026. And so I think that, there's going to be nuance to weather in both hemispheres. But when we see neutral INSO, I think you've got pretty good odds. You're not going to see any big problems in the southern hemisphere. And even thinking about that southern hemisphere wheat crop that starts to enter reproductive stages in late August and September, you got some pretty wet long-range forecasts in Australia and some pretty wet short-term forecasts in Argentina, so moisture should be rejuvenated there. So it seems like we kind of stack all this together. Maybe the next supply dislocation doesn't happen for some time. So again, thinking about managing risk, what do we do in the markets? If tomorrow's report is supportive or bullish, what do you do with it? And we're still thinking that recoveries, it's the outlook's not what we want it to be, but we do need to manage risk properly, and we want to take advantage of recoveries if we see it. So thoughts?
Really good rundown, Ben. And the sorghum really surprised me. I mean, those are big stocks at 93 million bushels and just kind of adding to the overall feed grain pile, which you pointed out too. So we'll see what the USDA says tomorrow. This is a very thorough idea in terms of where we're going and what we're looking at. Again, managing risk is key. And thank you for watching today. Final words, Ben?
I don't think so. No, we'll kind of start with the USDA report, but then after that, I think 10 minutes after the report's released, it's kind of back to weather. And does August stay as good as July is the next question.
Yeah, it looks good at least into the 25th or 26th of July. Have a great trading day, everybody. Be well. We'll be back tomorrow in a USDA report that comes out 11 o'clock on Friday. Be well.
Bye-bye.